Hello everyone, my name is David Kiernan. I'm a Curriculum Officer at NCFE, and this webinar is for revision strategies for the Level 1 and Level 2 Technical Awards, which cover the subject areas of graphic design, interactive media, and music technology. And the plan for today's webinar is to first give an overview of the qualification and the resources we have available for you to use, the best revision strategies to use according to the research, methods that can be used to help learners revise for the external assessment, some technological tools that can aid with revision, and finally, how you can address any questions you may have to us. So we're going to begin with an overview of the Level 1 and Level 2 Technical Awards and the resources that you can access. So the Level 1 and Level 2 Technical Awards consist of an external assessment and the internally assessed coursework. Now for music technology and graphic design, the external assessment is worth 50% towards the final grade, and the internally assessed coursework is worth the other 50%. With interactive media though, the external assessment has got a 40% weighting, and the internally assessed coursework is worth 60% of the final grade. All three of the subject areas have 4 units, and each unit is internally assessed with the coursework, but they're also externally assessed with the invigilated external assessment. This means you will need to have completed teaching the entire specification before learners can sit the external assessment. Now, graphic design, though, is an exception to that, as only the first 3 units are assessed in the external assessment. So when the first 3 units have been taught for graphic design, then learners will be able to sit the external assessment. QualHub will be your primary go-to for resources, specification, assessment, regulations, and much more. If you just begin by typing your qualification subject area, if you know the qualification code, or even just Level 2 Technical Award, it's going to bring up a list of suggested qualifications. And we have several resources available to help you with the delivery and assessment. So we've got schemes of work, which completely outline entire units of work, all based around 1-hour lessons. We also have complete PowerPoint presentations covering the teaching content from the specification and includes teaching activities that you could use with your learners. There are also individual lesson plans for each presentation too, with suggested timings, lesson aims, learning outcomes, suggested assessment activities. And finally, there is a workbook or individual worksheets to accompany the lessons. And these can be used for homework, flipped learning opportunities, or even just for revision. Whatever you decide, with all of these resources, it's best to edit them and use them as you see fit for your learners. Now, using actual assessment material is a good way to make revision effective, and the material I'm going to show you is available on your QualHub page. So for all the qualifications, you're going to find these past or sample exam papers. So these are for the external assessment, which can be sat in the spring and summer term each year. And of course, with the external assessments, there's also mark schemes, and they give the descriptions of the different levels of answers that would be marked. There is the Chief Examiner's Report, and this is very useful to give an insight to how learners perform nationally on different questions, where there were strong answers, which answers are answered incorrectly, common errors, and that can help inform your future teaching. Now, even though the focus for this session is on the revision for the external assessment, I'm just going to briefly mention the internal assessments, as they cover the same content that would be in the external assessment. And we have produced sample tasks for you to use for the internal assessment, and we also have sample learner portfolios. As there is content crossover with the internal assessments and the external assessment, some of the exemplar portfolios can be used for revision, and we're going to look at some ways you could do that later on. So let's get started with revision strategies that are the most effective according to the research. So Professor John Dunlosky, a professor of psychology at Kent State University, examined the efficacy of 10 learning strategies from multiple research sources and found that only 2 were shown to be very effective. So out of this list, active recall and spaced or or distributed practice were the only ones that were demonstrated to be effective. So active recall and spaced or distributed practice. They were the only ones that were demonstrated that you could find that were very effective in a wide range of situations. Now, this isn't to say that the other methods aren't effective. It's just that these two are the most effective and have the most evidence behind them to support the effectiveness claim. So let's begin with active recall, with the most common examples of active recall being practice tests. I mean, in 1909, Edwina Abbott demonstrated in her doctoral thesis at the University of Illinois that practice tests improved learners' performance. And since then, there's been over a century of research later, and its conclusion is still being demonstrated. But active recall doesn't just include practice tests. It can include something as simple as the following. Two learners read and revise a piece of text. So they both read the same text and are revising that same piece of text. The first learner just decides to reread that text a second time. Learner 2 decides to quiz herself on what has been read. The second learner is undertaking active recall and is going to perform better. As the research also shows that rereading isn't an effective strategy, but that is a simple form of active recall. The second strategy that was mentioned to be very effective, this distributed practice or spaced learning versus what's referred to as massed practice. So massed practice or massed learning is when the revision is done in one continuous session with little to no breaks. Whereas spaced or distributed practice is when the sessions are spread out. So in this example, the same length of time is being dedicated to the revision, 3 hours, but by spacing the sessions out, they will actually have a more positive impact on performance. And here's some of the research actually behind that. So this first graph is taken from the 2013 Dunlosky research paper. And this graph shows how well learners performed on tests at the end of each learning session. But the 6 sessions were delivered in 3 different ways. So that line shows the 6 learning sessions being performed back to back, with the proportion of correct answers at the end of each session being plotted. So this is massed learning sessions, each session back to back, and the results they got in each assessment. And we can see that the scores began around 85% correct and continued to improve into the mid to high 90s. So 0 days, no breaks, mass sessions, quite high scores the learners were getting. The second line, these are showing the results when the sessions were spaced out by 1 day. Now the scores weren't as impressive at the start. They began much lower, 50%, but still continued to increase the learners at the end of each session, reaching a similar level to those sessions that had 0 days between them, the massed sessions. And the final line, this one is when the 6 learning sessions were spaced out by 30 days. So 1 lesson, then 30 days later, the next lesson, 30 days later, the next lesson. And we can see that their scores were the lowest at about 20% and rose to the highest around the 70s, but nowhere close to the near 100% scores that the other groups are getting with 0 days and 1 day. So on the face of this, just looking at this aspect alone, this does appear to suggest that distributed practice or spaced practice isn't actually good. Mass practice is better, we're getting better scores. However, the researchers, there was one more test taken 30 days after the final learning session for all of them. So 30 days after their final session, session 6, they were given one more test. Those whose sessions were back-to-back, the very big massed ones, that's their score there, mid 60% range. Those who were in the sessions that were spaced by 1 day scored actually better than the 0 days in between. They are into the 80-ish%. And for those whose sessions were separated by 30 days, scored highest on the final test, getting into the 90% bracket of correct answers. So this just shows what a powerful impact distributed practice can have on performance. All learners in those sessions were taught the same thing. The only difference, they were given the same tests. The only difference was when they received their sessions. If they were immediately, if they were separated by 1 day, or if their sessions were separated by 30 days. And those who had the longest distributed, the biggest distributed section of 30 days actually scored much better. Another piece of research that demonstrates the same effect on distributed practice was carried out by Dr. Jeffrey Karpicki, a professor of psychological sciences at Purdue University. And in his study, learners were tested 1 week after their initial learning session. This is what the graph is showing, how the learner performed differed from different techniques. So learners were tested 1 week after their initial learning session. And that's what we have on this graph. So studying something just once without any recall produced an average of like 1% performance. Recalling at least once performed better. We can see it's just shy of 30% there, 25% to 30%. Recalling multiple times, one after the other, all grouped, immediate, or massed together, caused really no additional learning gains when compared with recalling just once. So repeating something several times compared with repeating just once didn't have any big difference. But recalling multiple times was demonstrated to enhance learning only when the repetition was spaced out in that final graph, in that final chart that we have there. The proportion recalled for spaced and repeated was approximately 3 times higher than that of massed together and repeated. So it would be best to incorporate distributed practice throughout the delivery of the Level 1 and Level 2 Technical Award V-Certs. Now, these are the revision strategies that Professor Dunlosky examined, and while the research strongly demonstrates the efficacy of active recall methods and distributed practice or spaced learning, whichever it is you want to call it, I do want to highlight some of the other findings, beginning with highlighting. Highlighting was one revision strategy strongly favored actually by learners. Learners really like highlighting overall, but in practice, it doesn't contribute to higher performance. In his own words, Professor Dunlosky said, when students are using a highlighter, they often focus on one concept at a time and are less likely to integrate the information they're reading into a larger whole. So as a result of that, that was one comment that Professor Dunlosky made. So highlighting can be a good starting point, but it often needs to be built upon and active recall added in to make it as effective as possible. Rereading, as shown in previous research, doesn't impact performance by much. This is also another method preferred by learners. So try to steer learners towards distributed rereading. If they're going to do rereading, let's try and get them to do it spaced or distributed rather than massed. That would be much more helpful. Summarization, that's a surprising one, I will admit myself, as I and probably many other teachers might have advocated for that method. But the research suggests, and again, this is Dunlosky's own words I'm going to quote here, students would go back and reread, would learn as much as students who write a summary as they are reading. So the interesting thing, that was Dunlosky, one of the things that he found that rereading, it's just the same as writing a summary as you're reading. There's really no difference in the performance there. So, and he also believes that this might be learners need help in how to summarization, training on how to do it more effectively is probably going to be more useful. Now, the other methods that were showing promise, though, there were some other methods that showed promise. Interleaving, which is sort of part distributed practice and part mixing up the order of materials across different topics. Elaborative interrogation. So, for example, explaining why something is true or false. A method I've mentioned in a Stretch and Challenge webinar as well to demonstrate high expectations. And self-explanation. So explain how new material learned is related to previous material. So there's some other methods that shows promise. So let's move on to the external assessment itself, put some of this research into action, and how we can get ready for the external assessment. But first, let's make sure we're fully aware of the external assessment, the style of questions, the allocation of marks, and so on. So the external assessment, it is the same for those who are registered on the level 1 qualification and those who are registered on the level 2 qualification. Learners will sit the same assessment. And learners are allowed one resit opportunity, and there are exam opportunities in the spring and summer term each year. Whichever external assessment the learners actually perform better on is the grade that counts towards their final grade. The assessments themselves as well, they aren't on a set date or time. You're given a window, and that's what we're going to look at now. So for music technology, you're given a week-long window to complete the 2 external assessments, a written paper and a practical paper. Each assessment lasts 2 hours, and learners will need a computer because there's audio files that they'll need to work with, but not internet access. For graphic design, the assessment is 10 hours long, and learners have a 4-week window in which to do that assessment. And they will need internet access for their assessment. And interactive media is 15 hours long. So learners have a 5-week window in which to do this. And much like graphic design, they also need computer and internet access. So the external assessment, the questions in it don't vary much year on year. For interactive media, the first task is for the learners, requires them to consider all aspects of the brief and create a plan for the content and layout of the interactive media product. The second task is the creation of the product from task 1. It may not be a completed version, but learners must demonstrate evidence that the product shows sufficient functionality. In the next task, in task 3, learners are required to evaluate their interactive media product in relation to the brief. The evaluation should include a review of how the product has met the brief and how to improve the interactive media product. For graphic design, the first task will require learners to interpret the brief and come up with their initial design ideas. Task 2, the learners need to experiment with those ideas. It should be clear they have experimented with all 6 graphic design components. Task 3 is the creation of the final product. And task 4 is an evaluation, where learners should give detailed conclusions about the appropriate use of the graphic design components. For music technology, the practical external assessment, there are also 4 tasks. With the first task asking learners to configure the DAW, the Digital Audio Workstation project for importing the supplied audio and the supplied audio files. Task 2, learners are asked to edit the audio material that they've been given with the DAW tools. Task 3, Learners are required to develop the supplied material by adding a musical part and editing a software instrument to create a new sound. Task 4, learners are asked to produce a final mix by use of corrective and creative balancing and processing. And there is also the written paper for music technology, and there's three main categories of questions. Multiple choice questions, or sometimes there might be drawing lines to match up type questions. We have shorter response ones of, for example, 4 marks, such as describe and explain. And there are the longer response questions of 6 marks or more, and they're usually evaluation type questions. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Chief Examiner's Report is a very good resource to use. And you can also find the grade boundaries in there. So do bear in mind that learners need to achieve a minimum of a level 2 pass in each internal assessment and in the external assessment to achieve a grade on the level 2 qualification. So if your learners are enrolled on the level 2 technical award, they need a minimum then of a level 2 pass in all the internal assessments and the external assessment. These on the board there on the slide are the most recent grade boundaries. And when compared to those from summer 2019, there was no difference, or at most, just a 1 mark difference. So the grade boundaries may not change much year on year, but do check the most recent ones if you're doing mock exams to give a good indication of how your learners are performing. So let's put some of the techniques that we mentioned into action to revise for this type of assessment. Now, one technique I used for sort of the factual and knowledge recall elements was to give my learners a set of questions for homework. In this case, I've got 10 questions about interactive media. And I would tell my learners that next lesson, there's going to be a quick starter quiz of just 5 questions. And those 5 questions were actually on that homework sheet. I'd display the 5 chosen questions on the board, and learners would answer them in their books and then peer or self-assess the answers at the end. And this doesn't need to be set as homework, can easily be done within lessons too, but using questions is a great way to incorporate active recall. And you can get the learners involved as well, either by having them make their own questions for each other. And there is research, I'll show you that on the final slide, that shows that learner-generated questions can actually have a positive impact on performance. Another way of using active recall is the use of flashcards. In this case, I've got graphic design question on one side and the answer on the other side. And it would be good to start flashcard production from the beginning of the course, as soon as your learners begin this course. So for example, depending on how often you see them, it might be every week or every month or every half term, learners are to produce flashcards on what they've learned. And then they can use those flashcards as lesson starters or plenaries every so often. This way, they will have built up a bank of flashcards by the end of the course. And they will have done, as well as that, some distributed practice, some spaced learning by using them in the lessons. And a great thing from the teacher's perspective, it takes practically 0 teaching or planning time to actually implement this. Just have a plenary of you're going to produce some flashcards or a starter. It's a nice, quick one, but it can have such a good impact on learners' performance if done correctly as a form of active recall. Now, Dr. David Newland from Western Sydney University researched using exemplars with learners, and his findings showed that learners actually want exemplars and they do find them useful. If learners do a piece of work, then they have to wait for it to be marked and feedback given, whereas an exemplar helps them to identify their own weaknesses. They lead to an improvement in learner performance, and exemplars can make the criteria and standards very transparent. And it makes it more tangible to the learners as it's set in context. The drawbacks are that it could lead to a lack of creativity or plagiarism from your learners, and they can be time consuming to produce. Well, for the time issue at least, you can use some of the sample portfolios for the internal assessments. So in this example, I've got a level 2 pass example for music technology of a learner going through the hardware components of a digital audio workstation. And you could get learners to actually analyze that piece of work, decide what is good, what needs improvement, maybe even what grade they think they would give it, and add or improve that, and add to and improve that model answer. Learners could also then, to add an extra layer to it, they could swap their evaluations with each other, compare what they've put and discuss them. And this is just another example of active recall, but it can also introduce higher order thinking skills if you're getting learners to evaluate and justify their decisions. Now, this is an obvious one, but it should never be overlooked, using past external assessment papers. They're available for every subject area, and for music technology, the audio files are also there. This also helps learners become familiar with the requirements, the questions and tasks, and the layout of the assessment papers. And you can actually spread out, because of the nature of the practical paper being set as separate tasks. It could be spread out during the year, where you give learners task 1 for revision or even just for homework, and then later on a second task. So it can be part of distributed practice. But it is certainly one of the most researched and validated ways of revision is performing and doing past papers. Now, for music technology, there are usually at least 2 evaluation questions. So one approach to help learners prepare for those sort of evaluation questions is to use these 4 quadrants. So for example, you place the question in the center, and then learners have to summarize the key aspects and use the correct terminology. As these evaluation questions, the mark scheme is very similar for them. For example, outline the key components to the first technique, the key information for the second technique, compare the 2 techniques, make links between them, and then in the 4th box, finally decide which is best, justifying their choice. And for most of the evaluation questions, those are the elements that need to be present in an answer. So this can help to train learners to include them. And this can still be applicable to graphic design and interactive media as well, using something like this. For example, you could place an image, a logo, different types of texts in the center, and get learners to address 4 elements relating to it. So for example, let's say there's a campaign called Everyday Heroes, and their goal is to recognize ordinary people who go out of their way to help their community, their neighbors, etc. And this is the image that they're planning to use for that campaign. Then we can get learners to analyze the image in terms of color, tone, etc. How well does the image match the campaign's message? What changes or experimentation might they do with the image? And then what impact might those changes actually have? So you could do this with online images, or use images the learners themselves have produced, and use the quadrants for peer assessments. So as well as just grabbing any image that you'd like off the internet, using the learner's own work in the center and getting a peer assessment could be done as well. Now there's some, I'm mentioning subject-specific ones. Hopefully you'll see those techniques could be used for any of those 3 subjects, for music technology, interactive media, or graphic design. I'm just not going to mention any subject-specific ones now, just going to give some generic kind of examples of other revision activities that could be done. And this one is where you would have a 6x6 grid. And in each square, you write a question, or you could get learners to produce their own 6x6 grid. And then learners would roll a dice to get 2 numbers, a number for the row and a number for the column. And then the learners would have to answer the question that's in that square. Alternatively, you could have keywords on each squared, and learners have to come up with a definition or a question for that word. And for example, do check the specification. On the specification, in there you'll find a glossary of terms. Maybe you could put a definition or one of those keywords from the glossary in each square, and learners have to give a definition. Or learners, maybe if they roll, they have to take two words from two different squares and try and link them together. So building in some self-explanation, as was mentioned as a previous technique, having to just link in different aspects and topics together. So there's a wide range of options you could do with this sort of technique. Around the clock is another way of revising by subdividing a topic into 12 categories. So a learner is to make notes in each segment for 5 minutes, and then the learners to cover it up or flip it over and recite back to you what they've done. So for example, you might ask them, segments 1 to 5 were about X, tell me about it. Or instead of just reciting what they've written, you could have questions ready to ask the learner instead. And it doesn't have to be entirely open-ended either. You could put specific questions as sort of titles for each segment as well. Learner on trial can be quite an engaging one. So you're to choose one learner who has been accused of the terrible, terrible crime of not revising. That learner is given some time to get their defense ready, in other words, some revision time. And while that's happening, the rest of the class are to prepare questions for them. The other learners come up with these questions to ask the defendant, and in the end, they decide if they're guilty or innocent of the crime of not revising. Now, it may seem like the focus is on the one learner, the defendant, but since the rest of the class are actually asking the questions and are coming up with the questions, that will actually impact on their learning too. As I mentioned already, research does show that learner-generated questions have a positive impact on performance. And we're going to finish off now by just looking at some different technological tools that you may find useful for learners to use during their revision. Now, during the course of COVID-19, lockdowns and so on, you may have become familiar with Google Docs and Google Forms or Microsoft Forms as well. And I'm going to go through one way of using it to create quizzes or even homeworks. And when you start a new form, you can choose what type it is from multiple choice, checkbox, drop-down menu, and more. When you click on the sentence icon, you can choose to make it a quiz, whether learners actually see their result immediately or later, whether they can see the correct answer, and so on. So a range of options come up for you. Here, I've written some interactive media questions and selected the correct answers. And as feedback is vital for learner achievement, you can actually add feedback to the quiz. And you can actually add feedback for incorrect answers or correct answers. And this could be even links to revision websites if needs be. Edpuzzle is a website that allows you to add content to online videos. So you can search and add content to videos from YouTube, Khan Academy, TED Talks, and others. If you actually use Google Classroom, you can actually link your class to Edpuzzle as well. Now you can search for a range of different videos on what topic you'd like, and there are some ready to use ones that others have already put together. And what you can do is to a video, you can add multiple choice questions to certain parts of the video. You can even add in open-ended questions, or they could just be used as discussion boxes either to elicit learners' current thinking. You can actually add voiceovers or post-it notes to sections of these videos as well. And you can also edit the videos by cutting or trimming certain parts of them. And when you've finished, you when you finished your editing, you can actually then assign it to your learners. And one really nifty feature, I think, is you can actually prevent learners from skipping the video, from skipping through the video to different parts. This way you can be assured that the learners had to watch the full video and didn't just skip to the multiple choice questions. Insert Learning. This is a Chrome extension that allows you to insert content onto any web page and share this with your learner. And you can highlight text, you can add questions, discussion boxes, post-it notes, and so much more. So in this case, I've gone on to the McDonald's website and I've added a discussion box. And I want my learners to comment on the imagery, the use of color, etc. in that Happy Meal image. I can then share the website link with my learners, and that will include that Insert Learning discussion box. So quite useful as well for online learning, for revision. Quite a lot you could do with Insert Learning. Flipgrid is best described as a social video discussion platform. And on this website is where you would actually post a discussion topic, and you can actually write in specific details. You can just put a title and add in more specific details to get learners thinking. And you can actually add links to other websites or include videos, links to different, if you did Google or Microsoft Forms, you can include links to that as well. And you can then share this with your learners. Now, you can either have your classes set up, or you can make the discussion topic public, where a join code would be required to access it. Flipgrid is actually in the process of making Google Classroom the ability to include and import your Google Classroom available on Flipgrid as well. I believe that's for the 21st of December 2020 that's going to be integrated. So if you use Google Classroom, fingers crossed that they meet the deadline of the date they've set of December 21st, 2020, you will actually be able to have your Google Classroom and Flipgrid connected. But on the topic, when it's shared with your learners, your discussion topic, learners actually are able to reply with a video. And there's a host of options actually on the website, just like there are different options on things like Instagram, TikTok, and so on to make them more exciting and engaging. You can actually apply different filters and things like that on a Flipgrid video response as well. You can then, when they've given you that video, you can actually provide feedback to the learners, either by a video yourself, or it could be by audio only, or can just be a typed text comment as well. Grading criteria can also be incorporated into this, such as rubrics. And as I mentioned earlier, you can actually search for some pre-made topics as well, and it might give you some ideas of things you could do, or just use these ready-made ones and assign them to your learners. So that first result there, principles of graphic design, there is one on graphics design ready that you could just issue to your learners. And the final one that I want to mention is called Mentimeter. And Mentimeter is an interactive online presentation software program, and it's free. There are some limitations with the free version, which I will mention. And the interactive element allows questions to be submitted, quizzes to be taken, and so much more. And you can make an unlimited number of presentations, but in one single presentation, there's only a maximum of 2 questions and a maximum of 5 quizzes per presentation. Now the questions, so they would be questions that can be submitted by learners if they're curious and want to ask questions about a topic. There is a profanity filter on there, just in case and you had any little cheeky learners. There is a profanity filter. But my personal preference is to make presentations, just make one slide with my quiz, and then I just add it into my regular PowerPoint presentation instead. because Microsoft PowerPoint does have an add-in that allows you to insert Mentimeter slides into your presentation. But even if you can't do that, there are other ways that you can allow learners to access the quizzes or insert questions, whatever it is. For example, there's a QR code that learners could just scan. If you just put that on your PowerPoint, they could scan the QR code and then they will be able to access the quizzes. There are website addresses you could display on the screen either that learners will be able to access that way. But there's a few options to allow learners to access the Mentimeter, the interactive element. Now, I do hope you have found this webinar useful, and thank you very much for viewing it. If you do have any questions, you can contact me directly, davidkiernan@ncfe.org.uk. If I'm unavailable, our general email address is curriculum@ncfe.org.uk. I have mentioned a few websites there. They are the links to those websites that I mentioned. And I did also mention about the research regarding learner-generated questions. They are the sources that show that learner-generated questions can have a positive impact on performance if you want to read more about them. Thank you very much for attending, and I hope you have found this session useful. Bye.